Welcome, everyone. We're giving everyone a few seconds to join from the waiting room. This is Sabrina Paganoni, and I'm connecting from the HEALEY Center for ALS at Mass General, and I'm here with our patient navigator, Catherine Small, and our administrative assistant, Jesse Rosenthal. And today is the second Thursday of the month, which means that we are very excited to have a webinar fully dedicated to expanded access, or EAP. And we're especially excited because tonight we have a speaker who is very dear and close to us, dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jinsy Andrews from Columbia University. So she'll talk about the EAPs that she's leading. So Jinsy, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone joining tonight to talk about expanded access. And I obviously am working on one of the expanded access programs that have been funded through ACT for ALS. But I did want to start with a little bit of a refresher on EAP. It's always good to kind of review it and kind of think about how things have evolved over time about the traditional concepts of EAP to what we're dealing with today in ALS in our community. I know there are some people I've seen in clinic today at our ALS clinic who are joining tonight. So hello, it's nice to see you guys. And I know there are some people that saw me recently and are looking forward to this. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover very briefly, actually, because I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. But I'm just going to briefly go over expanded access again, just refresh ACT for ALS specifically, and also talk about the NIH-funded expanded access program that Clene and Columbia and Synapticure have collaborated to provide to the ALS community. So if you go to the next slide, I think the first thing I wanted to talk about is terminology, because in the last few weeks, as I've been doing clinic and as I've been speaking at certain functions, there's been some confusion about the terminology. So when you're getting a drug before it's FDA approved, that's considered pre-approval access. And that can be even confusing in and of itself. So a clinical trial is the most common way in ALS where people get access to drugs before they are approved by the FDA here in the United States. And so usually the medication or the product is usually referred to as experimental therapy or investigational product or investigational device. And it's really to use comparator groups to look at efficacy or an effect on some sort of health outcome. Similar to that, people will often refer to open label extensions. Now, open label extensions is another way to access the drug. However, usually that investigational product, if it's given through open label extension, it's an extension of a main study. So typically it's offered to participants of a clinical trial that participated in the controlled portion. So that is limited in its availability and accessibility. Now, one confusing term is off-label. So off-label means that a drug does have FDA approval. However, it is not approved for use in ALS. So if there's some sort of preclinical studies that repurposes an available drug, and we have examples of that right now in our community, and we then are able to prescribe it after a risks and benefits discussion with your healthcare provider, then that medicine is being prescribed off-label. So it's considered quote unquote investigational or experimental for ALS. And so the only caveat there is it's not a clinical trial, but you do need to talk about what the potential side effects are, why you would even consider it for ALS. And there might be some hurdles with insurance or payers covering it because it wasn't the original intent of the FDA approval. It wasn't approved for that particular indication. Now, expanded access is what we're going to focus on today, which is also referred to as compassionate use. But in the US, we call the official mechanism is expanded access EAP. Compassionate use is often a term that's used for an official program that's offered usually in other regions abroad. But it provides a pathway for people to gain access to an investigational drug or biologic, really for treatment of a serious condition where there's no comparable or satisfactory therapy available outside of a clinical trial. And so ALS is a diagnosis that fits the eligibility criteria, and if you're not getting it through a clinical trial or open label extension, and if the company or the manufacturer is able to provide it to you, then you will then provide a pathway towards expanded access. Now, there's a couple of things that are required. Company has to be able to provide the drug. FDA approval is required, and you have to sign an informed consent. And often there are some people that will interchange expanded access and right to try, but right to try is a different mechanism. It was recently signed into legislation, and state and federal laws can differ, but it's another way to access investigational products outside of a clinical trial. It really hasn't been used much in ALS because the expanded access mechanism has functioned properly in ALS, and the right to try does have caveats that a drug has to have completed phase 1 testing, and there are other eligibility criteria for a compound to be requested through right to try. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to lay out the terminology, but when you think about expanded access, people ask, well, what should I think about, when I think about expanded access? And so I always have this discussion. This is my own personal kind of conclusions and after discussions with people about how they should think about it. But, I think expanded access is the step you take after you've discussed and reviewed all the risks and benefits of approved therapies in your region with your healthcare team. You've established your care with a specialist or an ALS center. You've discussed and reviewed also your genetic testing and whether you should go through with it or not with your healthcare team, because sometimes there are experimental therapies targeting specific gene therapies that might be afforded to you. And then you also sometimes consider alternative or off-label use treatments, such as supplements, off-label treatments like we discussed before, and the rationale for considering it in ALS, and you review the risks and benefits with your team. And then once you've exhausted all those options and you want to participate and you're not clinical trial eligible, you would then proceed with EAP. If you go to the next slide. And so you've seen this in the previous webinar that I gave. But excuse that, I'm in the hospital right over the emergency room. The multitasking. About expanded access protocols, this is a pathway. So I put this definition here because this is a traditional way of perceiving expanded access. It's for a serious or life-threatening condition to gain access to an investigational product outside of a clinical trial when no comparable treatment is available, and it's really intended for treatment. But if you go to the next slide, expanded access has different mechanisms by which you can access drugs through this mechanism through the FDA. It can be a single individual patient, it could be an intermediate size patient population, or it can be a treatment IND or treatment protocol. What I will say is that the expanded access programs that have been offered in collaboration with Clene, with CNM-AU8, have been through the intermediate size patient population expanded access programs. So if you can go to the next slide. So what I will put here is that I actually added a bullet since I've initially presented this starting in 2018. We talked about the interchanged terminology of expanded access, compassionate use, treatment use. And the primary objective, if you read the regulations about expanded access, is that it's really meant to be a treatment for an individual who's got a serious life-threatening condition that's exhausted all other options. So traditionally, EAP was not intended to obtain information about safety and effectiveness of an investigational drug. However, the Act for ALS programs are a little bit different and kind of combine a little bit of research and with the in parallel with access to an investigational therapy through expanded access. So I think the traditional view of EAP is a little bit different and not exactly applicable to what the funded programs are through the NIH, because NIH funds research grants. And so Act for ALS allows us to expand the opportunities to participate in expanded access programs and access to drugs. But all of the programs are required to ask and answer specific research questions and contribute back to the base of knowledge of ALS and basic science. So they are, in essence, both access and research. So they're a little bit different and more of a gray area. Go to the next slide. And so I just want to point out that Act for ALS is not just about access for investigational therapies, but it has public-private partnerships. It has a grant program for basic science, but essentially the overarching goal is really to innovate the development of and increase access to potential new treatments for ALS. And we do that by doing it in all sorts of different ways, not just giving the drug, but understanding the biology of the disease, investigating clinical outcomes, biomarkers, and so on that are embedded within these programs. And if you can go to the next slide, it's just to summarize all the aspects that are included in the Act for ALS. So it's not just about the research, but also making sure that everyone is collaborating and all stakeholders are involved in trying to prioritize important topics in ALS, and also trying to make sure that we have partnerships across the field. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about the CNM-AU8, which is the compound that I received funding for at Columbia in collaboration with Clene and also with Synapticure. So first I'll talk about the compound. You've heard this before, and some people have had trouble kind of keeping track of what it is. CNM-AU8 is a compound that essentially is a crystalline structure. It's not like a small molecule. It's not a monoclonal antibody, but it's a crystalline form of gold that allows NADH to convert to NAD without the requirement of all that cellular machinery. So in neuronal death or in motor neuron death, there's a loss of NAD and a loss of mitochondrial function. And so increasing that NAD levels improve the mitochondrial function, and hopefully it leads to enhanced neuronal function. And it's through this action that there's hope that CNM-AU8 provides neuroprotective effects. So if you can go to the next slide, this is just a summary slide of all of the trials that have been completed. So there were 2 phase 2 studies that were completed, Rescue ALS and also the HEALEY ALS Platform Study with CNM-AU8, and it provided some evidence that we did need to move forward the 30 milligram dose. And there was some rationale in expanding its access to a broader population of people living with ALS. Now, I did provide a webinar in January with Clene about their clinical development program. They are planning to launch a phase 3 study. On the end of this slide, on the right-hand side, there's EAP. There's EAP listed. That expanded access protocol is different than the NIH-funded program. So this is one that was at the Healey Center, and one that was an intermediate-sized multi-center. This is actually collapsed into one EAP program, but that intermediate expanded access program is different than the NIH-funded program from Clene. And the NIH-funded program through Columbia, Clene, and Synapticure is really intended for people that have not yet been exposed to CNM-AU8 and haven't had a chance to participate in the previous EAP. So I just wanted to make that clear. If you go to the next next slide, excuse me. The objective of the NIH-funded grant is really to provide access to CNM-AU8, and the primary objective is really to evaluate the safety and tolerability, and also evaluate the efficacy of the investigational product in ALS participants. And what's really nice about this grant is that it is providing 144 weeks of active treatment to those that enroll into this NIH-funded expanded access program. So all participants will receive open label CNM-AU8, and it's the 30 milligram dose. It can be taken orally, it can be taken through the feeding tube, and the visits will be conducted on a recurring basis. And we're hoping that we collect biomarkers and we collect clinical data, but not in the depth by which you would do it in a clinical trial, but enough to assess safety and tolerability. But we also are partnering with Synapticure, which would be the specialty telehealth clinical care provider, to be a virtual site. And really one of the goals of the study is to assess the feasibility of doing a remote EAP enrollment and monitoring, and seeing if that can be decentralized in the future for other EAP programs. So if you can go to the next slide, the Safety is one of the biggest things that will be measured in this particular NIH-funded expanded access program with CNM-AU8. We'll be collecting individual reports of changes of health and obviously study event surveillance, meaning like, was there a hospitalization? Was there a side effect? And are there any abnormalities in the lab values? For efficacy, typically in an expanded access program, you just provide the drug and you just provide clinical care. But because this is a blend of both access and research, we will be collecting breathing assessments. There will be ALS-focused questionnaires. There will be blood collections and medical and safety assessments. So this is a little bit more, and it's to answer some of the questions that are laid out within the grant application. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to provide a status update. So currently, similar to our presentation at the end of January, we're still operationalizing the trial process. There are multiple sites involved, and so we have to execute all of our contracts and get the IRBs up and running. And we also have to try to make sure that we have all the components of the research program in place so that we can operationalize it. We're hoping that in partnering with academic centers and also a virtual hub for enrollment, that we can actually get participation in all 50 states and include remote and rural areas, which is one of the goals of this particular NIH-funded grant. And we're hoping that we can get our first patient in the second quarter of 2024, but hopefully sooner. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. And in addition to this new EAP, Clene will continue to conduct its current ongoing intermediate ALS EAP programs that have already enrolled over 250 participants since 2019. So that will run in parallel to this NIH-funded grant, because there was some confusion about that program and this program, but they are different, distinct, and have actually two different intents. So I think that's just an overall summary of the project, and I wanted to kind of leave room for some questions and answers to be able to help provide some information. So hopefully this was helpful.
This was great. And I think, there's a lot of definitions that people are asking about, and that's great because it means the field is advancing, creating new approaches, a new framework for thinking about this. So these things, I think, Jinsy, I think that when you and I started working in this field, that these things barely existed. So it's good that now we have a lot of different options. So questions about the definitions, because I see that people are asking.
Yeah.
Can you clarify what off-label means? I know that was in one of your initial slides.
Yes, I put that intentionally because I've been asked actually all week, this week, last week. So I'll use a specific example, and hopefully I don't get in trouble. But I'll use an old example. So back in the day, not too long ago, lithium, which is FDA approved to treat bipolar disease, was investigated in a single center and thought to slow down disease progression and improve survival in a small study. And so that drug was then readily available by prescription, actually. So a lot of individuals did ask their primary care doctors and their psychiatrists to just prescribe lithium, but they did not have bipolar disease. They were seeking it because they had ALS, and there was some studies that showed that it had an effect in slowing disease progression. So in this scenario, lithium was already FDA approved and available by prescription, but approved for the indication of bipolar disease. So it's available by prescription. And then physicians would prescribe it, but not for the bipolar disease, but because people with ALS were interested in taking it because there was a preliminary signal of effect in ALS. So you're taking an already FDA-approved drug for a condition that it's not approved for. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And then the other question is a little bit about the difference between EAP and right to try. So let's say that somebody would like to enter a clinical trial, but is not eligible. What's the difference between EAP and right to try?
Yeah, yes, I was going to say ALS Untangle is a great resource. I have to say at NEALS, at the Clinical Trial Consortium NEALS, we do have educational webinars that like way back from 2018. And I think we've done a couple of times to kind of distinguish right to try and EAP. But what I will say is that in expanded access, which is the most commonly used mechanism in the US for ALS, expanded access requires a physician and a person living with ALS to look at a drug and say, we might want to try it outside of a clinical trial. We have to make a request to the drug company or the manufacturer or the sponsor, and they have to say yes. And then whether the company or the physician, so the company or the physician can then apply to the FDA, and the FDA has to provide approval before you can initiate any further activities. Once the FDA approves the expanded access to that investigational drug, then the investigator will then have to put in IRB submission and get ethics approval at their institution. And the person living with ALS will need to sign an informed consent form and follow a protocol that's been already approved and reviewed by the FDA and access the drug. So that's the expanded access mechanism. In Right to Try, the Right to Try legislation was implemented because there was a perception that maybe the FDA was the holdup in accessing experimental therapies outside of a clinical trial. But in essence, they do approve, there is a time clock, and they do approve greater than 99% of the applications that go in for all disease indications. But that legislation went in, and in that legislation, a physician and a person living with ALS may look at a drug, and if it has completed phase 1 testing in humans, so that requirement is not required in expanded access, and the drug company is willing to provide it, then after a discussion of risks and benefits, and it is variable from hospital to hospital, they might require an ethics submission or an IRB submission, and it is very important to have a risk-benefit discussion with the physician, but there is no FDA application. In that scenario, the drug is then provided to the hospital or the clinic, and the physician will then have the responsibility to provide the drug to the person living with ALS and monitor, and still have to monitor safety and report any safety events that occur. So the big difference is that FDA has oversight over expanded access programs, but not any treatment or investigational product that is available through Right to Try. And there's a formal protocol and informed consent that's required through the expanded access program, but it's not necessarily required, and it varies from institution and clinic depending on their local policies. So that might not be required under the Right to Try, but there is a requirement that the physician in both scenarios have to monitor safety and ensure reporting of any safety events to the FDA.
So there's a high volume of questions. So I'll try to, lump some of them. Some of them are about access, and I think they're all relevant. So essentially the idea is, first of all, how can somebody get enrolled in an EAP? What if, for example, you're trying, but your site doesn't have, is full, doesn't have options for EAPs. And so those are some, other questions about access, and also if people can participate from abroad.
Yeah, so I think the toughest question embedded in there is if accessing an investigational product through expanded access in the United States, because it's FDA oversighted. So if you're living abroad, it can be challenging. And I have to say that there are equivalent programs in Europe and in other regions. So they're referred to as compassionate use or other mechanisms, but there are mechanisms available through the regional regulatory authorities. One of the challenges in the international aspect is that if you're accessing the drug, the shipment of drug across international borders can be a little bit tricky, depending on where the drug is manufactured. So that's one of the hurdles. But typically in the US, I think one of the toughest things is if you actually have a conversation with your healthcare provider and it doesn't seem like there's a program available, and they might not be available, they might not know. There are databases that you can search. Clinicaltrials.gov does publish some of the expanded access programs. IMALS also tries to keep track of some. I think as a community, we're trying to create repositories. The NEALS website also does have a repository of expanded access programs. But if there's a drug that you're particularly interested in, it's important to see if if you can identify who the manufacturer is and try to reach out to them to see if the drug is available, because drug cannot be accessed if by expanded access if the manufacturer or sponsor is not willing to provide the drug. So that's like the first step.
Right. Another sort of set of questions is about kind of the impact of the NIH. I believe you already clarified that the NIH is funding EAPs in the US under FDA guidance. But it takes time to set up these large studies, because now we're going from essentially EAPs not being available anywhere pretty much to many sites now participating in multiple EAPs. So that takes some time. So can you help explain why that's actually taking a little bit of time, I would say, to start up? Yeah.
It feels like a long time. And I think one of the challenges is that there was a lot of excitement for the funding that was released initially for all of the programs, and the fact that we were able to kind of get the grant applications in. And so there was a quick announcement that was broadly made. And then, it actually preceded some of the release of the funds and trying to get the ball rolling actually for a lot of this. When you try to do one of these NIH grants, it does require, it's government funding. We have to make sure there's a lot of documentation so that it is auditable, how we execute the trial, how we structure the infrastructure to make sure people are monitored and safely monitored. The protocols need to be ironed out and submitted to the IRBs. Contracts need to be negotiated. And sometimes that can be slow. Contracting, I'll say I'm at Columbia. Columbia can be a little bit slow with contracting. And so it's a little bit challenging sometimes to get all the moving parts. So vendors need to be set up, sites need to be set up, contracts need to be set up, IRB needs to be set up, budget needs to be set up. And so all of this does require a lot of effort, a lot of people, and a lot of time. And so I'm hoping that once we have this round of EAPs up and running, it should set up some foundation to help speed up launches of future EAPs. So that includes, getting the staffing and getting the centers all equipped to participate in EAPs in the future.
A few questions about CNM-Au8 specifically. Can you tell us more about the dose rationale or your thoughts about efficacy, more specific to your program?
Yeah, so what I will say, I don't own the intellectual property, and I don't, for EAP, it is the dose that was selected and also selected for future development is the 30 milligram dose. That was based on data that was presented today and also previously, and I think some of the survival data has been presented by Clene itself. The preliminary signals were consistent at the 30 milligram dose for CNM-Au8, and they did test two different doses, both in the HEALEY platform trial and also in another trial. So the 30 milligram dose was the dose selected based on the effects seen on neurofilament and also on survival. So I showed you Rescue ALS, I showed you the HEALEY platform ALS trial, both were placebo-controlled trials. And then also the expanded access programs, Clene has been working diligently to do propensity matched scoring and assessing survival that way. And so they have seen signals, which will be presented, I think, in the future as well, at meetings about survival differences that were noted by using historical controls. And so the rationale to move to a phase 3 study really is based on the 30 milligram dose and the changes in neurofilament that they were able to observe and the survival data. So those were the two key efficacy points. And they also have seen that in the EAP when they use historical controls as a comparator. So that was supportive evidence also for the efficacy and the rationale for carrying it forward.
Yeah, there's a question, what if somebody is actually eligible for a clinical trial, but there are no clinical trial available? For example, the clinic doesn't participate, or they're geographically distant, or the trial is full. Can that person participate in Right to Try or EAP, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think in that way, I think this has come up multiple times in our webinars, and I know me and you both have answered this question, but I think it is true that if you're technically quote unquote clinical trial eligible, but there's no clinical trial available for you, then theoretically you could access a drug through expanded access. and technically you're not able to access a clinical trial. That definition, though, is a working definition, and I think it will vary from program to program. So I definitely would check the inclusion-exclusion criteria for each of the programs, or discuss that with your healthcare provider, or even with the manufacturer if you're having conversations about it. But theoretically, if you're clinical trial eligible, but there's no clinical trials available to you, I mean, from my personal standpoint, I think that does allow for you to access a drug through a different mechanism.
Right. I see there's a few questions here about how the recent news about Relivrio impact the platform trial or EAPs. I will say that there's no specific impact, in the sense that people can make their choice in consultation with their physician, can stop it at any time if they wish to do that. So at least for the platform trial and the EAPs that I'm involved with, it might be different for other trials. I cannot comment for that. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Jinsy, on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's that holds true for some other trials as well. But I think we have the data and we have to make decisions, and I think it'll be up to the healthcare providers and the people taking it to decide.
Any final thoughts on expanded access? And I just want to say that we'll invite you back. We love having you, and and also great question that's coming in right now. What's the best way to stay informed? On all of this.
Yeah, obviously these webinars, I'm a big fan of these webinars, and I have to say that I am, in working with the NEALS organization, I'm hoping that there's a way to kind of complement these webinars with additional information. There is an information hub called Roon, ROON.com, and that is something that is trying to be updated with the information that seems to come at such a fast pace. I will say that even us clinicians are having to work hard to keep up with the information, and hopefully things like this and having these discussions will help us stay informed. Having a centralized hub of information, or having these Q&A, like Ask the Expert webinars, is I think the best way forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And on that note, we'll see everyone next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody, and I tried my best, but we'll keep everybody informed as things go forward.
Thank you.
Really excited for the future. Take care.
Thank you so much.